I want you to think about the oldest car you've ever personally seen still running, not in a museum, not parked as a display, actually running, out on the road, starting every morning, carrying someone to work, doing its job. Maybe it was a neighbor's car. Maybe it was something your parents or grandparents drove. Maybe you've seen it at a garage or a used lot with a mileage number that made you do a double take. And if you think back to that car, there's a very good chance it was Japanese. Not because every Japanese car becomes a legend, plenty of them don't, but because when a Japanese car does reach the kind of mileage that makes people stop and stare, it tends to do it quietly, reliably, and without drama. And the question I want to answer today, the question I think most car content completely fails to answer properly, is not what makes those cars special. It's what makes the people who own them special. Because I promise you, after everything I'm about to share, you'll realize the car was never really the secret at all. Here's a belief that is so widespread it's basically accepted as fact. Japanese cars are just built to last. You hear it everywhere. Buy a Toyota, it'll run forever. Get a Honda, it'll outlive you. And there's genuine truth buried in that belief. Japanese manufacturers do build with exceptional precision, tight tolerances, thoughtful engineering, and a philosophy of reliability that has been refined over decades. That part is real. But here's what that belief misses entirely. And it's the thing that changes everything once you understand it. A well-built engine that is poorly maintained will fail. Always. Without exception. And a modestly engineered engine that is maintained with absolute consistency and care will run for a very, very long time. The engineering sets the ceiling for what's possible. The maintenance routine determines whether you ever get anywhere near that ceiling. And the routine, the actual practical, repeatable system of care that the best Japanese car owners follow, is what we're going to spend today talking about. To understand where this routine comes from culturally, you have to understand something about how Japan relates to the things it owns and operates. There's a concept in Japanese culture, sometimes described as monozukuri, a deep, almost philosophical commitment to craftsmanship and the care of made things. The idea that something built well deserves to be treated well. That a tool, a machine, a vehicle is not disposable. It's something to be respected and maintained in proportion to its purpose. This isn't just abstract philosophy. It shows up in completely practical ways. Japanese workplaces have formalized inspection routines. Japanese public infrastructure is maintained proactively, not reactively. And Japanese car culture reflects exactly the same principle. Cars get inspected before they fail. Fluids get changed before they degrade. Parts get replaced before they break. And the result, the cumulative result of that approach applied consistently over years and decades, is engines that run forever. This is the routine. This is where it comes from. And every single part of it is something you can apply to your own car starting today. Let's talk about what a real Japanese-style maintenance routine actually looks like in practice, because I think most people imagine it's some complicated, expensive, professional-only system. It's not. At its core, it comes down to a few fundamental commitments that most car owners in other parts of the world either don't know about or simply don't follow through on. The first and most foundational commitment is this. You service your car on a schedule, and that schedule is non-negotiable. Not roughly on schedule, not when you remember, not when it seems like it needs it. On schedule. The mileage or time interval for each service item is a hard deadline, not a suggestion. And this sounds obvious. Of course, you should service your car on time. But the reality is that most drivers treat service intervals as approximations. They push oil changes a few thousand miles past the recommended interval because the car seems fine. They skip a coolant flush because nothing is overheated. They put off a transmission service because it's expensive right now. And in Japan, particularly among the drivers whose cars accumulate the most mileage with the least mechanical drama, that kind of delay is genuinely uncommon. The schedule exists for a reason, and following it is the foundation of everything else. The second commitment in this routine is what I think of as the proactive inspection habit. And this is where the Japanese approach differs most visibly from what most Western car owners do. In Japan, there's a formal vehicle inspection system called the Shaken, mandatory, thorough, government-regulated, that forces every car owner to have their vehicle comprehensively checked every 2 years. Dozens of inspection points covering the engine, brakes, suspension, emissions, lighting, and steering. If you fail, you fix it. Full stop. But here's what's interesting about the drivers whose cars last longest. They don't treat the Shaken as a deadline to scramble before. They treat it as a confirmation of what they already know, because between inspections, they're checking things themselves. They're opening the hood periodically. They're looking underneath the car occasionally. They're checking fluid levels, looking at belt condition, glancing at tire wear. They notice the small things before they become big things, because they're actually looking. And that habit, that regular informal self-inspection, is available to every single car owner in the world, regardless of what country they're in or what inspection laws apply to them. You don't need a government mandate to look at your own car. You just need to decide that it matters. Now, let me get specific about fluids, because the fluid maintenance side of this routine is where I see the most preventable damage being done to engines all over the world, and it's almost always the result of either not knowing or not prioritizing. Let's start with engine oil, because it's the most talked about and still the most misunderstood. The core truth about engine oil is this: it has a functional lifespan, and once it's past that lifespan, it doesn't just stop helping, it starts hurting. Fresh engine oil does several jobs simultaneously. It lubricates metal surfaces to prevent direct contact and wear. It suspends combustion byproducts and carries them to the filter to be removed. It neutralizes acids that form during the combustion process. And it transfers heat away from components that would otherwise run dangerously hot. Every single one of those functions degrades over time and mileage. The base oil oxidizes and thickens. The additive package that neutralizes acids and keeps contaminants suspended depletes. The oil becomes saturated with particles, and byproducts it can no longer effectively remove. And at that point, every mile you drive is a mile driven with degraded protection on every moving surface inside your engine. The Japanese maintenance routine addresses this simply and completely. Change the oil on time, every time, without exception. Not when it looks dark on the dipstick, not when it smells burned. On the schedule, whether that's every 4,000 miles, every 5,000, every 6 months, whatever interval is appropriate for your engine and oil type. The mechanics I've spoken with, who work on the highest mileage Japanese vehicles, are remarkably consistent on this point. They don't spend a lot of time debating which brand of oil is best or whether full synthetic is worth the premium. What they care about is the interval. A mid-grade conventional oil changed faithfully every 4,000 miles will protect an engine better over 200,000 miles than a premium full synthetic changed every 12,000 miles. The quality of the oil matters, the timing matters more. Coolant is the next fluid in this routine that deserves serious attention, and it gets far less than it deserves. Most drivers understand that coolant keeps the engine from overheating. What most drivers don't understand is that coolant does a second job that is equally important and completely invisible. It protects the internal metal surfaces of your cooling system from corrosion. Fresh coolant is chemically formulated to maintain a specific pH that keeps the inside of your radiator, your water pump, your thermostat housing, and the coolant passages inside your engine block from corroding. Over time, typically 2 to 5 years depending on the coolant type, the chemistry breaks down. The pH shifts. The coolant becomes acidic. An acidic coolant doesn't protect your engine, it attacks it from the inside. It eats away at aluminum surfaces, it causes scale buildup that reduces heat transfer efficiency, and it accelerates wear on rubber seals and hoses. None of this produces an immediate dramatic failure. It's slow, progressive, invisible damage until it isn't, until a water pump fails, a radiator develops a leak, or an overheated engine blows a head gasket and turns a minor service into a major repair. The Japanese maintenance routine includes coolant flushes on schedule without negotiation, because the cost of the flush is nothing compared to the cost of what happens when you skip it. Brake fluid is another fluid that the best Japanese maintenance routines take seriously, and that most drivers in other markets treat as something they never need to touch. Here's the critical thing to understand about brake fluid. It is hygroscopic, which means it actively absorbs moisture from the atmosphere over time. As it absorbs moisture, its boiling point drops. Fresh brake fluid boils at a temperature high enough to handle even aggressive repeated braking without vaporizing. Old moisture-saturated brake fluid can vaporize during heavy use. And when brake fluid vaporizes, you lose hydraulic pressure. The pedal goes soft. In extreme cases, the pedal goes to the floor. This is not a theoretical risk. This is a documented real-world failure mode that happens to vehicles whose brake fluid has never been changed. Japanese mechanics flush brake fluid on a regular schedule, typically every 2 years, because they understand that this is a safety item, not just a maintenance item. And yet, in most Western markets, brake fluid flushes are among the most consistently skipped services on the entire list. The cost of the flush is trivial. The cost of brake failure is not. Transmission fluid deserves its own mention because it's one of those services that gets deferred more than almost any other. The consequences of that deferral are severe and often irreversible. Automatic transmission fluid lubricates and cools a transmission that contains dozens of precision-engineered components operating under high mechanical stress. It also carries hydraulic pressure that controls gear shifts and clutch engagement. Fresh transmission fluid is clean, correctly viscous, and chemically intact. Old degraded transmission fluid is contaminated, potentially slightly abrasive from metal particle accumulation, and chemically depleted. Transmissions that are serviced regularly with fresh fluid at the correct intervals consistently outlast ones that aren't by enormous margins. A new automatic transmission can easily cost $3,000 to $5,000 or more. A transmission fluid service costs a fraction of that. The Japanese maintenance routine includes transmission service on schedule. Not when the transmission starts slipping or shifting rough, but proactively before any symptoms appear. This is the pattern. Serve before symptoms, service before failure, service before you have any reason to believe there's a problem, because by the time there's a reason to believe there's a problem, you've usually already lost the window to prevent it cheaply. Now let's talk about driving behavior, because the maintenance routine isn't only what you do in the shop, it's what you do every single time you get behind the wheel. And the most damaging driving habit that most people don't even recognize as damaging is how they treat the engine in the first few minutes of every drive. When an engine has been sitting overnight, the oil is drained down from the upper sections of the engine, from the camshafts, the valve train, the top of the cylinder head, and has pooled in the oil pan at the bottom. When you first start the engine, the oil pump immediately begins building pressure and circulating oil back up through the engine, but it takes a few seconds for full pressure to be established and for oil to reach every surface that needs it. During those first seconds, the upper engine components are running with reduced lubrication. At the same time, the engine is thermally cold. The metal hasn't expanded to its operating clearances, the combustion chamber geometry is slightly different, and the fuel mixture control is operating in a different mode than it does at normal temperature. This is the most vulnerable state your engine ever occupies. And the correct response to that vulnerability is patience. The Japanese maintenance routine includes what experienced mechanics describe as a respectful warm-up. You start the car. You allow it to idle for 30 seconds to a minute, enough time for oil pressure to fully build and begin circulating through the entire engine. Then you drive away gently, not slowly or timidly, just smoothly, moderate acceleration, staying below 3,000 RPM, not asking the engine for maximum effort until it has reached normal operating temperature, which typically takes 5 to 10 minutes of driving. This is not complicated. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't add meaningful time to your commute. But done every single day, over the lifetime of a vehicle, this habit dramatically reduces wear on the valve train, the camshaft, the piston rings, and every other component that depends on proper lubrication and thermal stability to function without damage. The drivers who skip this step, who start the car cold and immediately accelerate hard because they're in a hurry, are making a small withdrawal from their engine's longevity account every single morning. It doesn't feel significant. Over 10 years it is. Smooth driving is the other behavioral element of this routine that I want to address directly, and I want to explain why it matters mechanically rather than just repeating the familiar advice. Every time you demand sudden hard acceleration from your engine, you're creating what engineers describe as a high mechanical load transient. In plain terms, every moving part in your engine, pistons, connecting rods, crankshaft, camshaft, valve train, experiences a sudden spike in mechanical force. The combustion pressure spikes, the temperatures in the combustion chamber spike, the exhaust system handles a sudden surge of hot gases. All of this is manageable in moderation. Engines are designed to handle peak loads. The problem is frequency. A driver who hammers the accelerator at every opportunity is subjecting every moving part of their engine to repeated stress spikes throughout every drive, every day. The cumulative fatigue from those spikes is real, measurable, and directly correlated with accelerated wear on critical components. Smooth, progressive acceleration eliminates the spikes. The loads build gradually. The temperatures rise gradually. The engine operates within its comfort zone rather than constantly being pushed to the edges of it. Over 150,000 miles, the difference between a smooth driver and an aggressive driver, all other things being equal, shows up clearly in engine condition and remaining component life. There's one habit in this routine that I consider the most underrated, most immediately actionable, and it's simply this. Learn what your car sounds like, feels like, and behaves like when it's healthy, and then pay attention when something changes. This sounds almost insultingly simple. But the number of preventable engine failures I've seen that began with an early symptom that was ignored, a slightly rough idle that came and went, an unusual sound on cold starts that faded after a minute, a very slight vibration that wasn't there last month, is genuinely staggering. Every one of those symptoms was the engine whispering that something was developing. Every one of those whispers was an early intervention opportunity. Cheap, fast, easy to address. And every time that whisper was ignored, the underlying condition progressed, got worse, became more expensive, sometimes became irreversible. The Japanese drivers and mechanics who maintain vehicles to the highest mileages treat every change in their car's behavior as information worth investigating. Not necessarily worth panicking over, but worth noting, worth mentioning to a mechanic at the next service, worth paying attention to rather than dismissing. They've developed a relationship with their vehicle's normal state, which means they notice deviations from it immediately. Warning lights get investigated promptly, not after a few weeks of hoping they'll go off by themselves. New sounds get mentioned at the next service, not ignored until they become loud sounds. Small leaks get addressed when they're discovered as small spots on the garage floor, not after they've depleted a critical fluid to a dangerous level. This attentiveness isn't mechanical expertise. It's not something you need training to do. It's a decision to engage with your car as a machine that communicates with you, and to take that communication seriously.